Hello everyone. Today we're going to be covering chapter 3, which is supply and demand. Within this chapter, we're going to cover several elements of supply of goods and services, the demand for goods and services, and economic modeling of supply and demand. Supply and demand is one of the most heavily used economic models in the science of economics. And what it does is it illustrates competitive markets and how competitive markets behave. A competitive market consists of many buyers and sellers participating in an active market that typically buy, in this case, a similar good that is considered homogeneous. A same good or service has identical products that consumers and buyers are looking for and that sellers are willing to sell in an active market. And the supply and demand model shows how competitive market works and how elements of competitive markets tend to benefit the seller and benefit the consumer when they both meet and agreed on a mutual exchange at an agreed market price. Now we're going to cover 5 elements of the market, which in this case consists of the demand curve, demand by consumers, the supply curve by the producers, demand and supply changes or any shifts, market equilibrium, and any changes in the market that occur due to several factors. We're going to start with the demand for goods and services, and the demand for goods and services can be illustrated in a demand schedule in a chart illustrated analysis. And the demand schedule shows how much of a good or service consumers will want at various prices in terms of quantity, the quantity demanded. So when we're looking at the demand schedule, consider the case for cotton. We have the price of cotton at $2, $1.75, $1.50, $1.25, and $1. And we have the quantity of cotton that can be demanded, quantity demanded at that price. At $2, the quantity demanded by the consumer is 7.1 units. At $1.75, quantity demanded is 7.5. And at $1.50, quantity demanded is 8.1. If you notice, we have what is called an inverse relationship. As prices drop, as the price drops, quantity demanded increases. It goes from 7 to 8 to 10. When the price value drops from $2 to $1, the lower the price, the higher the quantity demanded. This is an important feature as consumers typically tend to consume more as price decreases in terms of quantity. Lower prices yield higher quantity consumed. We can also illustrate this graphically in a downward sloping demand curve that shows the price in the vertical axis and the quantity demanded of goods and services on the horizontal axis. In this case, we have cotton that is being used, 7 units, 9 units, 11, 13, 15 units, and 17 at various prices. The demand curve is downward sloping, and it indicates an inverse relationship with prices. The higher is the price level, as price rises, an increase in the price level leads consumers to decrease the quantity consumed or the quantity demanded, since we're looking at demand. The lower the price level, as price drops, consumers move along the demand curve and increase the quantity demanded. So in this case, we're looking at the demand curve that shows how much of a good or service consumers want at any specific price and how the demand curve has an inverse relationship in terms of price and quantity. So as price rises, the quantity demanded falls. So it goes from 50 cents, look at 50 cents, the consumer buys approximately 14 units. But if the price increases to $1.75, the consumer only buys, the quantity demanded drops around, and the consumer buys about 8. So as price rises, quantity demanded falls, and vice versa. We can apply this to certain goods and services in the market, like gasoline. And gasoline is one of those heavily used products in the market in various parts of the world. In Europe, for example, France, Italy, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And the higher the price level in Europe, the lower the quantity consumed of gasoline per gallon in this case. So higher prices around $8 in Germany and the UK. The quantity consumed, it's about 0.2 or 0.3 per gallon in this case. The lower the price level in the United States at $3, the higher the quantity consumed per gallon, so about 1.3. So lower prices yield higher quantity consumed. So we can see here how the demand curve can be downward sloping. And there's various reasons why prices are more expensive in a different part of the world. It could be higher taxes, higher emissions requirements, and environmental laws. But for the most part, in Europe, is a little bit higher of a tax policy. This is highly reflective of the law of demand. The higher the price level, the lower the quantity consumed. And the lower the price, the more the consumer wants in terms of quantity. So in European countries, we may have highly fuel efficient cars, better infrastructure in terms of public transportation, or if you're in some part of Europe, you may use green transportation like riding a bike or electric vehicles for the most part. And when you're looking at the US has high consuming cars, lower prices, higher quantity consumed, American performance-based cars, and bigger trucks, where versus the US that has versus other countries like Japan that may have a smaller consuming car since they pay about $5 to $6 per gallon. So the law of demand is very consistent for most goods and if not all of the goods and services. The law of demand is one of those fundamental pillars that specifies that a higher price for a good or service, as price increases, everything else constant, it leads people to demand a smaller quantity for that good or service. If you lower the price, everything else constant, it leads people to demand even more quantity of that good or service. So the law of demand is an inverse relationship with quantity demanded. Higher prices, people buy less. Lower prices, people buy more. Think about when people rush to the stores on a holiday shopping spree or on holiday sales when there's 20%, 30% off. People buy a lot in terms of quantity. That may also later on increase the total demand. But lower prices typically induces people to consume more. Higher prices discourages people to buy products, and essentially they buy a smaller quantity. So for the most part, there could be a relationship between the downward slope of the demand curve and what we call the utility concepts. We're going to touch this later on in depth when it comes to why the demand curve is downward sloping in relationship to utility. If there's a high price for goods and services, consumers buy typically less, and that lowers the purchasing power and the satisfaction from spending more, and the consumer may substitute the product that became more expensive for something else. So it's a very important relationship that it has to the level of satisfaction of consuming a good or service. And when things become expensive, consumers substitute a product and buy something else instead. Now, when we're looking at the cases of the law of demand, it's important to recognize the difference between quantity demanded and the relationship with prices and a total increase in demand. Notice how I mentioned both of them specifically different. Quantity demanded and an increase in total demand. Quantity demanded typically is a response due to the increase or change in price. If the price increases, quantity demanded decreases. So if we are at $1.25, for example, approximately, we buy a quantity of 9 units. If the price increases to $1.75, quantity demanded drops from 9 to about 7. That's moving along the same demand curve. An increase in total demand, when the demand curve increases significantly, the demand curve, let me move this down here, the demand curve actually shifts if there's an increase in total demand. An increase in total demand is due to external factors that occur due to things that happen in society, like an increase in population that increases the number of consumers and increases the need for more clothing that is made of cotton or polyester. That will increase the total demand, and the demand curve can shift. So this is the demand curve in 2007. By 2010, we have more population, more people. The total demand increases at any given price. So people buy more of everything. The demand curve shifts. We need to make sure that that distinction is different. The law of demand is in relationship to prices and quantity. External factors or other factors other than price may shift the demand curve entirely to a new location, like more people, increase in population. So a shift in the demand curve is a change in the demand curve from D1 to D2 that changes the quantity from more units. So here we were 9 units, now you buy more at the same price. At any given price, people buy more because the total demand has increased. That's an important implication. So looking at this model that is illustrating D1 from D2, We go back here to our D1 is the original demand curve, and D2 is our increase in demand. We're going to see the difference between the shift in demand, which is from D1 to D2, demand 1 to demand 2. It's an increase in demand, to the change in price, which is from $1.50 to $1. So if you change the price here, you're looking at staying on the same demand curve. This is important because there's often a confusion as to, do we have a shift or do we have a movement due to a change in price? If price changes, point number one, if we're at $1.50, point A, and the price decreases to $1 in this case, you go from point A to point B. At $1.50, you buy 8.1 units, and if the price drops to $1, the consumer buys 10 units. So lower prices, you buy more units. Okay, that's the change in price. This is what happens when the price drops. You buy more units. That's a change in the quantity demanded along the original demand curve. Quantity changed from 8 to 10, 8.1 to 10. That's a change in price leads to a change in the quantity demanded. An increase in the demand curve, which is a shift from A to C, is the total shift. Notice how the price here has stayed the same. It hasn't changed. It's 150. But if there's an increase due to more population or something else, the consumer buys more units. It was buying 8. Now it buys a little bit more, about 9, at the same price. The price didn't change. What happened is something else made this curve to change. So a shift in the demand curve is not the same thing as the movement along the demand curve, moving from A to B because of the price change. $1.50 to $1. That's what happens with the price. This is differentiating between a movement that happened because of the price change, consuming more units, and an entire shift because it's something else. To summarize this idea, we have situations that shift the demand curve. What makes this shift happen? What can increase demand? What can shift the curve to a new level, to a new location, from D1 to D2? Well, we have population as one of them. Population, more people demand more service, more increase in total demand is a shift. And if you notice here, the point A to B or B to A, depending on where we're going, if the price increases, you go from A to B here. It only happens because of the price itself. A change from A to B or B to A happens because of the change in price that leads to the change in quantity. That's very straightforward. The demand curve stays the same on the same location. What factor shifts the demand curve from D1 to D2 to a new level? Well, if you have more income, you tend to demand more products in some cases. Your preferences may shift it. If your preferences increase, you increase the demand. There's price of related goods. We're going to talk about that, how price of related goods in consumption can affect your demand. The number of buyers, which are affected by the population levels or population changes, and the expectation about the future. Think about this situation of expectations about the future. When people were expecting the pandemic, they rushed to the stores. The prices didn't change much. They rushed to the store and demanded a lot of everything. The demand shifted. There were people waiting in line outside the stores. The expectations about the future. Nobody was certain, so people rushed to the stores. We need to distinguish between an increase in demand when demand increases and a decrease in demand. So a decrease in demand is when the demand curve, in this case, decreases and it shifts downward. A decrease in demand means that people demand less of everything. Regardless price, people demand less. It shifts closer to zero. It actually shifts left, to closer to the origin. Every time you're close to the origin, that's zero. And if you're away from the origin, your quantity is rising. So if you decrease the demand, then at any given price, consumers demand less. The total demand decreases and your quantity demand also decreases because you're consuming a lot less. In some cases, even none. What can happen to create a decrease in demand? Well, those factors that we mentioned is if people lose their income, people getting laid off, then that lowers demand. If we have lower consumers, lowers demand. If certain things are affecting your preferences, it lowers demand. Think about certain items that are not good. When there was a situation in the past when certain phones were actually catching fire and breaking, people started demanding less of that item because it was faulty. So that's a risky item, you demand less of it. So there are certain things that can shift the demand. For the most part, we see that people experience an increase in demand when the demand curve shifts away and shifts to the right. At any given price, consumers demand more units, more of everything. It's an increase in demand, which means demand is shifting out of the origin, away from the origin to the right. That's possible in most cases when people demand more of everything. Certain situations lower demand, like war in some location can increase the demand. For certain things, or natural disasters can increase the demand for necessities and so on. Now, when we're looking at evaluating each specific demand shifter, as I like to call them, determinants of demand shifting, demand shifters, increases in demand. So all of this determine if the demand curve shifts. Price of related goods, we talk about there's a relationship of goods that are substitutes and goods that are complements. The number of consumers is based on several factors. People moving from one area to another. There's a lot of people moving from the East Coast to the West and the West to the East Coast. That changes the number of consumers, so there may be an increase in demand. Population changes the number of consumers, like the example that we had, that increases demand. Immigration flows increases the consumers, increases demand, and also price of related goods. What are some related goods? Substitutes in consumption. And we touched briefly at the beginning. If the price of a good increases, the law of demand states that you buy less of that product and you demand a substitute, something else. So if you're looking at the case of gasoline, what's the perfect substitute for fuel-consuming cars? Well, there was a point that gasoline was increasing significantly in 1999 to 2000. Gasoline was 99 cents to $1. Now it's $3 or $4 in some cases. There's an increase in the price. What is a related item that consumers can still use? Well, a hybrid car, a highly fuel-efficient car. So your demand for the expensive item, the quantity demanded for the expensive item declines, and your demand for the substitute increases. So this is important because this is shifting both. If the price of one good increases, you demand fewer quantity, the quantity demanded drops, and then you demand or you substitute something else. You demand more of the other. Complements. If goods are complements, if they increase in price, demand less and consume more of the other, and so on. Complementary items, in this case, computer and software, are often complements. If you demand the computer for academic learning, like right now, then you increase your demand for a software that you need. So complementary items are also important. This is really relevant to today. A lot of people are demanding a computer for academic learning. Well, you need the software or the program to see the class live or online, or certain universities have a different software. So related goods could be complements and could be substitutes. Income can have an increase in demand and can have a decrease in demand depending in the direction of your income, where your income is going. If you have higher income, you demand less, and that's considered you demand more. If you have more income, you demand more products. More products, and that's a normal behavior. That's something that we see often. When people have higher income, they tend to increase consumption on clothing, on food, on travel, a new car, and that's considered a normal good. A rise in income increases the demand for the product. The total demand, the demand shifts. If the population has more income, the total demand shifts. Again, these are shifters. Every time you hear a shift, the curve is moving to a new location. In some cases, we see that for some reason, when your income rises, you demand less of other items. So demand curve shifts down. People stop buying some things. And that's considered inferior goods, when people buy less of items because their income has increased. And these are typically inferior items. Examples that I often relate to it, for example, if you have more income, you can go to Olive Garden and have wine and cheese and dine a good pasta meal. That's an increase in normal behavior. and you may consider a fast meal an inferior product. Not to say that none of them are good. Just for example purposes, a disclaimer. You may consider McDonald's inferior, and now you go to Olive Garden as a normal good. In this case, with higher income, or just go out fine dining as your new normal. With more income, you can now go all of the time, every weekend, and you may choose less healthier products. Those may become inferior, and so on, depending on what products are consumed. Your taste is a great example as to what determines the demand. If consumer tastes are changing, it increases demand for certain goods. If they decline for other products, demand drops. Consumer taste is crucial when it comes. If your tastes are good, demand increases, meaning good in terms of in a positive direction for some items. Everybody has different tastes, but this is more towards preferences, taste preferences, and useful products to consider nowadays important. If something affects your taste for that product, you buy less. Some certain news or certain events that may affect your consumption. This is mainly towards, for example, boycotting a certain store. People boycott their store, or a particular franchise, if their preferences or tastes have been affected by finding some news that are external to the price. Then you demand less. If people rush to buy some products because they heard something good about it, then they increase the demand. Expectations are also important. Expectations can be positive, expectations can be negative, and if people have positive expectations, they tend to go and demand more. They have negative expectations. Sometimes it lowers demand, and sometimes if they have negative expectations about certain things, they may rush even to buy some products before things happen. So expectations are crucial. Consumer expectations determine, often cases, the direction of demand to increase or decrease goods and services. The market demand for goods and services. As we look at the market demand for goods and services, we have the total market demand, which is everybody participating in the market, and then we have individual demand curves. We have Barbie here, Barbie individual demand curve, and we have Kent's individual demand curve. The individual demand curve, this is the individual person. Like in this case, I have Sally. In this case, I have Barbie. Barbie demands jeans, and she has a price. She can either pay $30 for 3 pairs of jeans, quantity. At a price of $30, she buys a quantity of 3 jeans. So notice how that's very different. At a price of $30, quantity demanded is 3 jeans. If we lower the price to $1, at $1 price, Barbie, we're moving along the demand curve, buys 4 jeans. If we add Kent's individual demand curve, let's say I'm Kent, at $30, Kent buys 2 units, and at $1, Kent buys 3 units. Every person buys different units at different prices. In this case, Kent buys two units at $30, while Barbie, at $30, she buys 3. This means that every person is different in the market, and they buy different units or different quantities in the market at the price level. And the market consists of both of them, the demand for the market. This is everybody that participates in the market. In this case, we don't have 2 people, Barbie and Ken. But if we have 4 people, 5 people, 100 people, we have the total demand in the market. At $30, what are both of them buying? Well, we have Barbie at $30, she gets 3. Ken buys 2, so 3 plus 2, we have 5 units at $30. So the 2 of them combined at $30, both of them combine 5. Where does that 5 come from? 2 units from Ken plus 3 units from Barbie. 3 plus 2, that gives us 5. At $1, we get 4 units plus 3 units, and that gives us 7 units at $1 for the market. So we're adding the horizontal summation, the horizontal sum for all of the consumers in the market in this case, which in this case are only 2. The demand in the market is the horizontal sum of all of the individual people or the individual consumers in that market, which are 2 consumers here. Now, for producers, switch gears to the supply of goods. Who supplies goods and services? Typically, producers, the firms, the suppliers. And the suppliers of goods, we're going to look at this in the supply perspective, the firm perspective, the producer's perspective, shifting away from the consumer. A lot of the goods and services that are consumed by the consumer are supplied by firms and producers themselves. And they have a positive relationship with prices. A producer with a higher price level gets a higher return per unit. So we're going to see here that their supply schedule has a positive relationship with prices. The higher the price level, the higher the quantity supply. As price rises, quantity supply increases. So if price is increasing in this case from 50 cents to $1 to $1.50 and $2, then the quantity of cotton supply from the suppliers is going to increase from 7 to 9 to 11 to 13. This is a positive relationship in the market. Suppliers at a higher price, they're willing to supply higher quantities in the market. So as price rises, in this case, the supply curve shows a graphical illustration that is a positive relationship. How much of a good or service any seller is willing to sell at a given price. So it's a graphical illustration. The supply curve shows a graphical illustration of how much a good or service, in this case cotton, any people or any supplier, any seller is willing to sell at a given price. And what we see here is as the price increases for any good, as the price increases, anything, people are willing to sell either low quantities or high quantities. So it has a positive relationship. As price rises, the higher the price level, the higher the quantity supply. So we go from 50 cents, supply about 8 units. The price rises to $1. At $1 we supply 10 units. If the price increases even more to $1.75, at $1.75 now we supply 12. It's a positive relationship. The supply curve has a positive relationship with prices. In some cases, the firm will like to get even higher prices to sell products in the market. We need to make that distinction as well. It's important to make the distinction. Changes in prices leads to a change in the quantity supply in a higher direction. The supply curve can also shift. It can increase and it can decrease. If the supply curve shifts, it has typically moved to a new location, indicating certain factors that have shifted or that have changed the original supply curve. For example, technology. Notice how technology in this case is not related to the price of that particular good that is being produced, like cotton. It's technology at its finest. If we have no technology, this is the supply curve before technology implementation. They have fields of cotton that are cultivated. And without technology, the supply of it is only based on the cultivation of cotton, the quantity of cotton supply. We have 7, 9, 11, 13, and 15. If technology is implemented, it can increase the total production and shift the supply curve. Technology adoption in the cotton growing industry can increase the supply of the product to a new direction. In this case, it's increasing it. It's shifting it out. Again, notice if it goes to the origin here, if it goes closer to this vertical line, you're approaching zero. Not the price, because the price is rising up. If the price drops, then the price lowers. But the supply curve is on the quantity side. 7 units, 9 units, 11. If the supply curve shifts to the right, it can increase the quantity supply. Notice how we were at 8, now we're at 10. So the supply curve after technology adaptation, it increases. It shifts out to the right. There's a lot of different factors why the supply curve can shift, why it can stay the same. But if it stays on the same location, it has to do with the price. If it shifts to a different area, it moves because of the different factors shifting supply, like technology. And technology is one of those things that shifts and changes everything. It increases the supply curve in this case. So the shift in the supply curve can generate a change in the quantity from 7 to 10 more, even if the price has stayed the same. The curve has shifted. So we need to make that distinction that the change in price from a dollar at $1 in this case, at a dollar price, we have quantity supply is 10 units, point A. If we increase the price to $1.50, if an increase in price to $1.50 increases the quantity supply to 11.2 units. So you're moving along the supply curve, point A to B. It's the same original one. We need to make that distinction. This is referred to as the law of supply. The higher the price level, the price increases from $1 to $1.50. From point A to point B, you have 10 units at $1. At $1.50, the supplier supplies 11.2. This is the law of supply on the same curve. It's not the same thing as the shift in the curve, which is from this original supply curve 1 to supply curve 2. What happened here is there's new technology. At the same price, at $1, you were only supplying 10, but now with the technology, at $1, an increase in supply shows that at a new point, you can now supply 12 at the same price. So technology sometimes facilitates everything. You can supply more at the same price or sometimes even lower. So they're not the same thing. So the movement between point A and B, it has to do with the price change. An increase in the price from $1 to $1.50 has changed the quantities from 10 to 11. But if you increase the supply curve to a different location, it's not the same thing. Something happened here. And what originally talked about was the supply curve shifting because of technology. Technology has revolutionized industries heavily. So the supply shift, if it's increasing, for the most part, ideally supply should always increase. There's certain situations where supply declines. But what creates this shift entirely from S1 to S2, a change in the supply curve entirely, and what has to do with several things. We can have resources, price of resources. If they become more cost effective, then supply of that product declines, increases. It increases in a positive direction. Technology, other goods and services that are related in production, the number of sellers. If you have more competitors, that increases the supply and availability of the good. The supply curve increases. Expectation about the future can also shift the supply curve. Taxes and subsidies, lower taxes to businesses may encourage them to supply more, or subsidies. If you subsidize a business, they can supply more potentially. Doesn't always happen. Government restrictions or government regulation. If you lower regulations, they may encourage the business to supply more, and vice versa, although these are a little bit controversial sometimes. And notice how the supply curve S1, if it just stays on the same point, it has to, in the same location, it has to do because of the change in price. From A to B is typically the price point. A change in the quantity supply, because you're looking at just the quantities, not the supply curve, has to do because of the price. It's a movement. You're moving from A to B. If the price increases, quantity supply increases. So make sure to have that distinction clear because they're not the same. The shift in supply can increase. If it increases, the supply curve shifts to the right. There's an increase in the supply because you're going away from zero. The supply curve shifts out to greater quantities. At any given price, there's an increase in the quantity from zero to large quantities. The price may stay the same. So it's an increase in the supply curve shifting to the right in the model, depending on how it's graphed. And a decline in the supply curve is a shift to the left, going closer to zero. And if you have less units available, the price may be affected later. So the supply curve shifts to the left. And some of you are saying, well, if supply drops, shouldn't the price increase? When we combine both the demand and supply curve, it's possible. It puts an upward pressure on prices with lower supply for availability of goods. So the supply shifts. Changes in input prices. We talk about input resources. If inputs become more costly and cost effective, or both of them, cost and cost effective, costly, higher, so it may affect the supply curve. If inputs are more expensive, you supply less. If inputs become more cost friendly, you supply more. Changes in the price of related goods that are byproducts in production. Goods that are byproducts in the production process, they can increase the supply or decrease the supply. Technology also positively influences supply. For the most part, technology has a positive contribution to production. Expectations. All of these are supply curve shifts. Supply curve shifts. the things that shift the supply curve. Notice how prices are very carefully stated that it's input price. It's not the goods price, it's the cost of inputs. And this one is saying that it's other goods that are related, not the actual good that you're producing, something else. Number of producers that increases competition and the supply of goods increases. Think about Korean barbecues. There used to be just a few of them. Now there's Korean barbecues everywhere. The supply of Korean barbecues are all over the place. Now we have government policy and restrictions that are typically positive if they benefit the suppliers, or if there's high regulation, they lower the supply of some goods, subsidies themselves. One that I often like to talk about is natural disasters. Sometimes they're not mentioned in most textbooks because they happen rarely, but natural disasters can happen, and they happen now occasionally, and they may distort the natural resources or the production of goods. In often cases, war, if it affects the infrastructure, it can lower the supply and distribution of goods to some extent if the war is felt within the country. And these are rare, but they happen in some locations, or instability. So if we're looking at the market supply of goods and services as well as analyzing this market supply, let's say we have two producers, Sylvia and Liu. Sylvia is an individual producer, and at $1 she supplies 2 units. If we increase the price to $2, Sylvia can increase the production and supply, can increase the quantity supply to 3. And then we have Liu, who is another producer that at $1 he's only able to supply quantity supply 1 unit, and at $2 he's only able to supply in quantity terms 2 units. So both of them, Liu and Sylvia, are individual suppliers. These are individual suppliers. And Mr. Liu here is an individual supplier. And then we have the market supply for both of them. So we have the market supply for the market. In this case, we have two farmers, 2 suppliers, Liu and Sylvia, and both of them make up the market. At $2 for the entire market, we get 3 units from Sylvia plus 2 units from Liu. In the market at $2, we add it together and we get 5 units. 5 units, 2 from Mr. Liu, and plus 3 from Sylvia, we have 5 units. At $1, we get 2 from Sylvia plus 1 from Mr. Liu. At $1, the market only has a total of 3. So we're adding the horizontal sum of the supply of both firms in the market, of both individual firms. This is indicating 2 individual supply curves. Sylvia plus Liu make up the market together. So what happens when we combine supply and demand? The twin forces of supply and demand in the market. The sellers and consumers or buyers meet in the market for mutual exchanges. Well, we have the market, which is where everybody participates. The demands are the consumers that have income, that have preferences, that consider substitutes and complementary items. And then we have, in this case, a number of buyers based on demographics, population, and expectations. Then they actively demand a product in the market and agree on a price with the supplier. And the supplier supplies good or service, and the consumer will demand that product at a specific price, and the supplier supplies specific quantity. The suppliers have the resources to consider, the technology, related goods. They have income expectations about future activity. They have to face taxes and government activity and so on. All of us consists of the market, the demand and suppliers, and then we have the market. So bringing together, we have our supply and demand model, the equilibrium model. The equilibrium in the market occurs when the quantity demanded by consumers is equivalent to the quantity supplied by the producers, which are the suppliers of the good. And if both of them agree in the market, we have an equilibrium price. And that is a market clearing price, meaning that every buyer, consumer finds a seller willing to sell a good, and vice versa. Every seller finds a consumer willing to sell their good. And they agree on a specific quantity of that good, as mentioned in the previous slide, that can be bought and sold, and we have an equilibrium quantity. The market clears. We can show that graphically in the chart or we can also model it with the supply and demand condition. We have an equilibrium price and the market equilibrium where both quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equivalent to each other. And then we have our demand curve that is downward sloping and our supply curve that is upward sloping. The equilibrium price here, it's $1. The equilibrium quantity is 10 units, and we have market equilibrium. The market equilibrium is always where the supply and demand intersect one another. We have an equilibrium price, an equilibrium quantity, and a market equilibrium, which is exactly point E. The market equilibrium occurs at point E for equilibrium, where the supply curve and the demand curve intersect one another. And we have a market clearing activity. The market is efficient, there's no missed opportunities, every seller finds a buyer and every buyer finds a seller. The seller that have higher costs don't sell the product, and the consumers that are willing to pay less don't buy the product. Typically the consumer that has a high willingness to pay buys the product, and typically the seller that has the lowest cost, price cost to produce sells the good and the market clears. So what happens if for any given reason the price is above the equilibrium price, which is at $1? If the price is over $1 in the market, what could happen if the price is over the equilibrium point? Well, it creates what is called market inefficiency. Market inefficiency often occurs here at $1.50. We have a mismatch between the demand curve and the supply curve. This is indicating that only and only in equilibrium the market clears. If there's a higher price, the sellers will want to supply a higher quantity, but the consumers, according to the law of demand, says that a higher price leads to lower quantity demanded. So if the suppliers at a higher price are willing to supply higher quantities, 11.2, but with a higher price, the twin forces of supply and demand are now opposing one another. There's a gap here, and the consumers only want 8.1 units, but the suppliers want to sell a higher quantity. Then you have more quantity supply, which is greater than quantity demanded, and we have surplus of goods. The surplus exists whenever the quantity supply at 11.2 is greater than the quantity demanded at 8.1, or exceeds the quantity demanded, because it's not in equilibrium. So you have to take the difference between 8.1 and 11.2. The difference between those two is considered a surplus of goods, which in this case is about 3.1 units. We have a surplus of 3 units. Suppliers supplied 11.2 units at a $1.50 price, but the consumers only want 8, so we have a surplus of goods that is not needed. That's considered market inefficiency if the surplus can go to waste. So what happens if the opposite scenario occurs? What if the price is actually lower at 75 cents? Well, at lower prices, the consumer demand, quantity demanded by the consumer increases because they want to pay less and consume more. At lower prices, the quantity demanded increases to 11.5, and the suppliers are getting a lot lower for a lower price for their good, so they're supplying only 9.1. So now you have a mismatch. At lower prices, the consumers want 11.5 units quantity demanded. The law of demand, at lower price, consumers want an increase of quantity consumed. But at lower price, the suppliers are not going to get a higher return for their product, so they're going to supply less. So now you find yourself in a shortage situation when the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supply, and is price induced. So you have a shortage between quantity demanded, which is 11.5 units, and you have a shortage between the supply of goods, which is 9.1. So you have a shortage of 2.4 units. It's the gap between those two. If the price is above, it creates a surplus. If the price is below the equilibrium point, it creates a shortage. Those are two inefficiencies in the market that typically affect market activity and is not mutually beneficial for the buyer and seller. Now, we have seen how the price can increase or decrease and affect the equilibrium, but what if the supply curves shift? What if the supply curve shifts, or what if the demand curve shifts? If we start at a price of 1, equilibrium 1, and quantity 1. This is a hypothetical market where you have the demand curve that is downward sloping and the supply curve that is downward sloping, currently in equilibrium 1, at a price of 1, quantity 1. If for any given reason the demand curve increases or the supply curve shifts, what can happen to the price and what happens to the equilibrium and the quantity? Well, if we experience an increase in demand due to higher income, that's an increase in demand. With more income, people buy more. We're going to have a new equilibrium point that's going to go from E1 to the new intersection where the demand has shifted. This new equilibrium point is going to be right here at the new intersection. It's going to have equilibrium 2, and that equilibrium 2 is going to push the price point up because there's an increase in demand. The price level has increased to the new intersection on the equilibrium point, so it leads to a higher equilibrium price. And now if you look at the quantity now has increased. And you think about it, if consumers are demanding more, well, the suppliers are willing to supply it, higher quantity, but they may push the price up later on. This is a complete adjustment. Sometimes the price stays the same for a while, and then the quantity is fulfilled, and then the price pushes up. According to this model, the price increases right away. We have a new equilibrium, and the quantity increases from Q1 to Q2. So this is the shift in demand. That changes the price and changes the quantity, and we have a new equilibrium point. And several things can increase the demand, like more income. Now, what about if the supply shifts? If the supply shifts for any given reason. We have our price 1. This is what is called a shifts in supply and a shifts in demand and how it changes the equilibrium. Price 1 for our original product, equilibrium 1, and quantity of 1. We are in equilibrium 1. In equilibrium, everything's fine. But for any given reason, the supply could be affected. If you have less supply, less inputs, some infrastructure issues, what if the supply decreases? And the supply can decline, let's say, if expectations are bad. They're not looking good. Business is shut down. If you have a natural disaster that affects your local region and the suppliers are mainly located in that area, and for things become more costly to produce. So the supply curve shifts. Notice how this quantity here is shifting that way to the origin, which is 0. The supply curve shifts. This is not an increase in supply. People often confuse the increase in supply leftward because it looks like it's going up this way, but it's not. It's shifting left. Remember that if it goes left, it's a decrease. And this is getting closer to the origin, which the origin is 0. What is pushing, if there's less supply, there may be an increase in the price level. Price point at the new equilibrium, which is E2, is higher with fewer units, and the quantity declines from E1 to E2. The quantity falls because it's getting closer to 0. So a decrease in supply, the curve shifts, leads to a higher price and a higher quantity, and a lower quantity supply at a new equilibrium point. So if you notice, if the supply curve declines, higher prices and less quantity. These are the supply and demand curve shifts that affect the equilibrium and affect the price and affect the quantity produced. Various scenarios can happen that may shift this situation. In some cases, we can have a simultaneous shift when both of them shift together. And this is where we're going to conclude because this is a simultaneous shift. Simultaneous shift means that both of them are shifting for various reasons, both of them, the demand curve and the supply curve. This is an advanced analysis. If the demand curve shifts, it's going to create a new equilibrium. We know that. And a new price and a new quantity. But what if the supply curve shifts also? Where's going to be the equilibrium? What if they both shift? Now, there's going to be two opposing forces, or two forces moving because they're going to shift. The demand curve is going to shift and the supply curve are going to shift. So you have the supply and demand curve shifting in a simultaneous analysis in the same model. So if there's an increase in demand, a large increase in demand, let's say there's a higher population boom, an increase in population with an increase in income, with more income, more population, there's an increase in demand. It's going to say that we're going to a new equilibrium with a new price and a new quantity. But what if the supply curve shifts? What if there's high demand and the supply curve declines? It shifts left, like if it goes this way, like small decrease. Note again, if it goes to the left, it's a decrease, not up because it looks like it's going up because the equilibrium is increasing. But if the supply curve shifts, it's no longer in equilibrium, what could happen? Well, there's a significant effect that decline the supply of goods. And this is external. Where would the new equilibrium be? here or in the new one. It has to be where the new demand curve is, D2, and the new supply curve is, S2, right here. The price is going to increase, and the new equilibrium will be where the both of the curves intersect now. Not here. It's going to go from here to slightly here, and then it's going to go to the new equilibrium. There's a transition point. So we have a new price. The price increases significantly to price of 2, a new equilibrium point, and a new quantity. The quantity here shifts from Q1 to Q2, even though the supply is affected because the demand is significantly higher. The simultaneous shifts can happen for various reasons in the market, and they tend to happen most of the time in some cases. And you may end up with a higher price later on in the economy if they're moving in different directions. Sometimes they can lower the price. It really depends. To conclude, thank you for this discussion of the supply and demand analysis. I appreciate the time. If you have any questions, please let me know. But another outcome or another situation here, we have a case that what if the supply curve is the one that's shifting a lot? If it's the one that shifts significantly a lot. So the supply curve declines a lot more here. It's a significant shift. Negative expectations, higher taxes, higher regulation. Producers have a bad expectation of the future. Supply curve shifts. Our new equilibrium, if it's just by itself, is going to be here, but if the demand curve increases slightly, which is here, an increase in demand, more consumers are demanding products, but the new equilibrium is going to be at the new intersection. The equilibrium point, E2, is going to be here at E2 at both of the new curves, and it still pushes the price up, but since the supply curve shifted more, the quantity actually, in this case, moves to the opposite direction, to the left. Actually, with the supply curve, it declines. It declines heavily, and the price has an upward pressure. Again, this increase in price doesn't happen right away. It takes some time for it to go increase, but in this model, it's increasing right away. It's an immediate adjustment at the new equilibrium point. In reality, in real time, it actually takes some time for the price to go up. The quantity does drop. And the demand is induced here by higher consumption. The supply decrease dominates the increase in demand in this situation.